Thanks for listening to this archive of Teaching American History's last Documents in Detail webinar for the 2020-2021 school year. This program broadcast live on Wednesday, May 12th, 2021, and the focus of the program was Frederick Douglass's 1876 Oration on Abraham Lincoln. Dr. John Moser of Ashland University was joined by Dr. Peter Myers of the University of Wisconsin at Eau-Claire and Dr. Joe Fornieri of the Rochester Institute of Technology. Thanks for listening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Moser. I'm professor of history and chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. Welcome to another episode of Documents in Detail, Teaching American History's webinar series in which we bring together thoughtful scholars to have a conversation about historically significant documents. We encourage all of you joining us today to participate in that conversation by submitting questions via the Q&A box. Please, the Q&A box, not the chat box, so I don't have to check both of them. We will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. Within the next week, you will receive an email with a link to request a certificate of participation, as well as a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. The speeches, letters, and other writings that we're using for this year's webinars are all drawn from our book, 50 Core American Documents. All of these documents are also available at the Ashbrook Center's voluminous document database located at tah.org. The subject of tonight's program is Frederick Douglass's Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln, and to help discuss it are Dr. Joseph Fornieri, professor of political science at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and Dr. Peter Myers, professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin at Eau-Claire. Both are also faculty members in Ashland University's master's program in American History and Government. I am also proud to call both of them friends. Joe, Pete, thank you for being here tonight.
Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure.
As I always like to start these things off, I like to ask, why does this document deserve to be included among the 50 core documents for understanding the United States?
Joe, you want to take a crack at that? I can, if you want me to start off, I can start off with a couple of thoughts, but
I'll let you go first.
Okay.
And then I'll piggyback.
Well, let's say just, I guess, a couple of quick things. I mean, for my money, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln are the greatest 19th century apostles of the natural rights doctrine. And so anything that involves, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln is for that reason intrinsically interesting. They are, of course, central figures, each in his way, in the drama of the Civil War, and the relation between the two of them is very, very interesting and very complicated. And it's full of significance, I think, for American political development at large. I'll leave it at that as an intro.
Well, I see the Civil War is really the pivotal event in American history, and both Lincoln and Douglass as central figures in this drama. And of course, we're still debating and living with the legacy of the Civil War and slavery and race. I agree. I think that they're both great apostles of the natural right tradition, and that we have an opportunity to get a window on Douglass's view of Lincoln and all its rich complexity, and what Lincoln represented to both the nation as a whole and to African Americans. I also think it's highly relevant, right, for what's going on today. There have been efforts to cancel Lincoln, to cancel Frederick Douglass. This monument in particular, and we see in many different places, Douglass, I think Peter would agree, was very conscious that this message that he presented here would endure, or he wanted it to endure. He was well aware of the occasion and its symbolic relevance for future generations, and so it invites us to really recur.
What more could you tell us about the context for this? Obviously, it's the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument in Lincoln Park, statue of Lincoln that's still there. How did this come to be? What anything you could tell us about the historical setting for this, I think, would be helpful.
It's a nice story. The story goes true so far as I know, that a woman, this story starts in 1865 when a woman who had been enslaved in Virginia was now free, I believe living in the state of Ohio, named Charlotte Scott. Upon receiving the news that Lincoln had been assassinated, was very much torn up in grief, and she made it known somehow, I'm not sure, that she wanted to donate $5 to start a fund to commission a monument in memory of Abraham Lincoln. And a local minister got word of this, and a collection process started, and it snowballed, and it spread really across a fair portion of the U.S. And it took a while, it took 11 years to bring the whole thing to fruition, but eventually approximately $20,000 was raised, and Thomas Ball, a sculptor, was commissioned to create this monument, and went through a couple iterations actually, and then finally ready to go. And this is the dedication of it on April 14th, 1876, is the 11th anniversary of when Lincoln was shot. I guess he died the following day. And the plaque at the bottom of the monument, at the base of the monument, reads, commissioned by the emancipated citizens of the United States. And this was entirely something carried forward by America's Black citizens.
Joe, care to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the fact that Ulysses S. Grant is present, that Congress is present, that you have an African American addressing this eminent gathering at the nation's capital. Again, that the symbolic import of that, and he says in the speech that earlier on this would not have been possible, right? This would have just welcomed violence and scorn. And I think it's that, and Peter, I think, handles this well. It's that dual perspective that runs throughout this. That Douglass addressing the nation as a whole, but also addressing. Also, I think we need to keep in mind his audience of those freedmen that have that he's speaking to, I think, in a more personal way, who have raised the funds for this. So the combination of the freedmen who have raised the money, as well as the President of the United States, Grant, and Congress and the court present, makes this a very, I think, important occasion symbolically.
Very good. Looking at fairly early on, and you made reference to this passage already, Joe. No such demonstration could have been tolerated here 20 years ago. He goes on to say, the spirit of slavery and barbarism which still lingers to blight and destroy in some dark and distant parts of our country. What do you think what is he talking about there? What are this spirit of slavery and barbarism?
Well, I think he's talking about the impending end of the Reconstruction era. He's talking about resurgent violence, especially in the ex-rebel states, and it's downplayed. And actually, you can find commentary that criticizes Douglass for not saying more about this. You can find commentary to the effect that that Douglass, as we were just saying, has this national audience really for the first time, and he doesn't scorch the country about the impending failure of Reconstruction and the failure to enforce with full vigor the civil rights bills that had recently been passed and the rights of the newly freed people. And I think there's no question that Douglass was acutely aware of what was going on and very much distressed by it, and chose here, I think, for prudential reasons, not to make that the theme of the speech. But it is part of the context of it.
Yeah, I think it's there. It's hovering and in the background. And of course, we have the hindsight of course, what happens once Hayes is elected, right? There's an end to military reconstruction, and the troops are pulled out of the South in the bargain that is made. And then soon, Peter, what time did the court strike the lethal blow to the Civil Rights Act of 1875?
Yeah, that was in 1883.
Yeah, so that was later. It's
that
coming.
Was after this, but there had been the Cruikshank ruling. I'm not sure. The Cruikshank ruling came in 1876, and I'm not sure if it came before or after the speech, before or after April. The Cruikshank ruling was the Supreme Court effectively saying that it was not going to enforce the Civil Rights Acts of 1870 and 1871. This was in response to the Colfax massacre that occurred in 1873 in Louisiana. That was on its face an egregious violation of civil rights. And those bills would have given the federal government power to act in response, in the court essentially for various, it's a difficult ruling to read, just because it's full of kind of legal technicalities, and but the court effectively said it was not going to enforce those. The other thing about the context, I think, to add, somebody who knows this better might be able to correct me, but I think that already in 1874, in the 1874 elections, the Republicans had lost control of the Congress. And the passage of that 1875 Civil Rights Act was a kind of tribute to a dying Charles Sumner, but it was understood at the time to be kind of the last of the civil rights measures that was gonna get through Congress.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
go ahead.
Well, the court, through a series of these cases that culminate with Plessy versus Ferguson, will eviscerate the Civil Rights Acts as well as the provisions of the 14th Amendment, right? The Privileges and Immunities Clause is eviscerated in the slaughterhouse cases. So Douglass is observing this, this kind of a retraction.
So before turning to the speech itself, I don't know if this is something that you can answer. There's a question about the statue itself and the figure of the emancipated slave. Do you know anything about how this particular design was approved and what the significance of that image was?
I can tell you a little bit, which is what I know about not a lot about that. Stacy Moses, by the way, thank you for the date of the Cruikshank ruling. He says it came out in March, so Douglas would have been aware of that. With regard to the figure of the newly emancipated guy in the statue, in a way, that statue depicts almost the process of emancipation. It's almost not quite right to call him newly emancipated. The model was an actual human being. It was a guy named Archer Alexander, and about his life I know very little. I know actually nothing about his life. And Thomas Ball, the sculptor, had come up with a certain idea about what sort of depiction of the relation between Lincoln and those enslaved he wanted to make. And the original idea provoked some objections because the figure of the lately enslaved man was deemed very passive, and that was and there were objections as a consequence of that. And so the statute we have is a modification in response to those kinds of objections. And as it turns out, Douglas himself wasn't thrilled with the depiction of Mr. Alexander in that monument, but he kept quiet about his reservations about it. And I think, honestly, I mean, this is just my 2 cents of interpretive opinion here. I think Douglas had a half of a point, but not more than that, in his assessment of the monument, because I think looking closely at that monument, I mean, after all, you're depicting Lincoln. I mean, it's a monument commissioned to Lincoln, and you're depicting Lincoln's greatest action, the Emancipation Proclamation. So there's going to be a figure whose enslavement has to be represented in that monument. But when you look at that statue, especially from the angle, it's in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. When you look at it from the angle of facing Alexander, you see that he's not looking up at Lincoln in a spirit of dependency or adoration or anything like that. He's looking forward and upward, and he's rising. I mean, the objection is that it shows the slave kneeling, and puts Lincoln in the kind of the position of a grand savior, right? But what you see in the monument really is a very muscular guy who's breaking his own chains, who's rising, who's moving forward, who's looking ahead. And so I think in some ways the objection to the characterization is not fair.
Stacy asks if Thomas Ball was African American.
Stacy, that's a question to which I should know the answer, and I do not. I don't think so, but I don't know.
No, I don't think he was.
I read that the statue was actually cast in Germany.
I think that is correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then, turning now to the, it's somebody comments, Thomas Ball was not African American. All right, thank you for that, Doris Keevan Frank.
Wonders of the internet.
Yes. So let's talk about this speech. A couple of things that I find most noteworthy is that Douglas clearly sees the importance of this event as a landmark for freedmen, for African Americans, and maybe we can discuss that further. The other is the fascinating characterization of Lincoln as the white man's president, right? Preeminently the white man's president. So I would like to spend some time with both of those, and I'm sure we're getting some questions in here as well from our audience. Maybe we should address the part about the importance of this speech in Douglas's view for African Americans first.
I've been talking a lot, Joe. I'll let you go ahead.
Well, of course, this is a moment, as you said, a landmark of empowerment for African Americans, that they had recently gained their freedom. And I think Douglass wants to, given events that have occurred, given the reversals that were occurring, the Colfax massacre, the Grant had to break the Klan in South Carolina. Some of these recently decided cases, I think Douglass wants to empower the African American community to continue its struggle for freedom and to recognize its autonomy here, and also full citizenship. There's the mention of gratitude, right? He says at the end of the speech that some still consider the African Americans as soulless. So this gesture of patriotism, this manly defense of liberty, which he hopes will continue, is a refutation of that in both symbolically and in speech, indeed. Of course, and Douglass himself is the great representative of his people at this time. So it looks, as Douglass himself says, the speech looks backward, present, and forward, like all great speeches. Rhetorically, this is a masterpiece. And I'll just say one thing in terms of the white man's president, because I know Professor Myers has so much to say about that. It's so eloquent that the speech, I think its rhetorical design can be compared very much to What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And Douglass very often used a technique known as rhetorical reversal. Okay, and for informal rhetoric, this is where you introduce a division. Okay, you introduce a division, consider a contrary point, and then you refute it. And so the discussion of the white man's president is coming from is the division taking into consideration critical views of Lincoln at the time, and even Douglass's earlier views. But there's a resolution, right? There's a refutation of that view, and then a resolution which provides a fuller picture. Just like when you look at What to the Slave is the 4th of July, it begins with the praise of the founders, and then it launches into a very profound critique of the failure to live up to these principles, and then a resolution at the end. So you have something that comparable in this speech. It really conveys the complexity of Lincoln's leadership for African Americans, for Douglass, and expresses, I think, Douglass's own ambivalence. Yeah. So.
Peter.
Jotting down a couple of thoughts that I don't want to forget. Yeah, I agree with all of what Joe said. About a word first about the context again, John, that you were bringing up. This is a great big deal for Douglass. I think when he says early on in the speech, first things are always interesting, and this is one of our first things, and the hour means Black America. And so Douglass is self-consciously speaking as a representative of Black America. I don't know that you want to say Douglass has elected himself to this position, but Douglass has been asked to give the speech, and it's Black America that has commissioned the monument, and so he's cast in this role. And so he accepts it, and it's got to be there's got to be a degree of intimidation. Intimidation maybe is a strong word, but trepidation, I guess, about approaching this topic. I think that probably has something to do with what we were observing earlier on about how you can see Reconstruction starting to go bad. And Douglass saying a little, but not a lot about that. I think Douglass's idea is, I'm representing Black America, now fully, well, I don't want to say fully enfranchised quite, but in a way, yes, constitutionally, and admitted to equal citizenship. And I don't want the very first thing that Black America, so to speak, says to America at large to be a statement of unbroken grievance. I want it to be to have a greater dignity and be a profession of virtue or a representation of virtue rather than simple subjection and degradation and complaint. And so I think that's part of the spirit of this also. I think Joe is exactly right. And it's a thing that, for the teachers out there who might want to devote some study to this, it's a consideration that would repay very careful study to compare what he does rhetorically in the 4th of July oration, the 1852 speech, that's probably the most widely anthologized thing that Douglass ever said, and this 1876 speech, because there really are important parallels. And far be it from me to put myself in the guise of a literary professor at this point, in the history of academia, but it is true that one of the devices Douglass likes to adopt, especially in his most important speeches, is he takes different personas, he takes different perspectives. He does that in the July 4th oration, and he does that here. And so he'll and it's kind of similar, the different ones he takes, not identical, but here he says, here's how Lincoln looks to white America. I defer to white Americans, or we do, in the worship, the reverence for Abraham Lincoln. He was, in some sense, he was your president and not ours. And then he speaks in the voice of Black America. He speaks in the voice of the radical abolitionists, of course, of which he was major representative. And then again, he speaks from the point of view of the politicians, of the elected officials, the statesmen, in the best cases. And that's kind of a way of saying he speaks from the point of view of the outsiders, and he speaks from the point of view of the insiders. And he examines Lincoln from all these different points of view. And it leaves you to wonder, and it's left a lot of commentators on the speech to wonder, what happened to Douglass in all of this? Where is Frederick Douglass in all of this? Because he says seemingly contradictory things about Lincoln. He says Lincoln was subject to the race prejudices of his white fellow citizens. And at the end, he says at one point that Lincoln harbored the unfriendly feelings toward my race that other whites did. But near the end of the speech, he calls Lincoln our friend and liberator. And so he says these things that don't really quite square with one another. And so you wonder, and he says them because he's expressing different points of view about Lincoln. But you wonder which is the real Douglass. I mean, I think Joe has it right, about the resolution. But there's a further question that follows from that. I mean, if that's the right resolution, that the genuine abolition ground, as he calls it, is not ultimately the best way to look at Lincoln. Then you wonder, why is the genuine abolition ground being expressed here at all? Because the speech is supposed to be a eulogy. It's supposed to be honoring the memory of Lincoln. And Douglass says things that, if you take them in abstraction, look more like trashing Lincoln than remembering him with reverence. So it seems, you could say it looks like it's designed to stir up controversy. I don't think that's the intention, but it looks like that.
Peter, I've often wondered, to what extent is Douglass he feels compelled, especially now he's here to honor Lincoln. He has to give an account of his own vehement criticisms.
Yeah.
And criticisms that were disseminated, amongst the African American community.
Yeah.
Even right up until 1864, when his criticisms after the second meeting, his criticisms diminish significantly. So I wonder if it's hard to know what his motive is, but certainly as a thoughtful individual, given his strong criticisms of the president, he has to somehow, I think, account for that. He can't simply gloss it over, and perhaps it makes him more, at least to his audience, more credible. But it is very nuanced, right?
Yeah.
It is very nuanced. This is, we still struggle with this today because selectively, someone will quote, he was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the first year of the administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of this country. Now, if one just abstracts from that, it's a very, almost postmodern view of Lincoln. If you just look at that and focus on it.
Yeah, that's what it seemed. That's why I said I don't really want to pose as a literature professor here. I don't want to lapse into postmodernism, but it does. And there are plenty of people who study literature who love Douglass, and that's what they make of him. When they read his autobiographies, they say, "Oh, he speaks in these different voices. He's making and remaking himself, throughout his career." And I think there's a portion of truth in that, and I think it's easy to go overboard with that. But with regard to this, when you pay attention to this language, first of all, in that white man's president passage, a close look at that language suggests he says awful things about Lincoln. Calling Lincoln the white man's president is one thing, because that's not an awful thing necessarily to say in itself, depending on how you read it, because it's true that the Lincoln was elected by a white electorate, so Lincoln was responsible pretty much exclusively to white America as an elected official. And if you want to say, that's justification for calling him the white man's president, all right. But when he says the following phrase, entirely devoted to the welfare of whites in this country, that Lincoln didn't care a fig about the fate of Black Americans. That's very harsh. And my reading of all of this is that, I'm not going to lecture about this now, but my sense of this is that when Douglass says some of these things, these really harshly critical things about Lincoln in the 1876 speech, he is saying things that he does not believe about Lincoln. And he's doing that for prudential reasons, his own prudential reasons. That's the way I would begin to make sense of it. We can get into the reasons, I suppose, as we go further on. Let me say a word further about why I think that. When he says that, for instance, he says Lincoln shared the unfriendly feelings of his race toward mine. So Lincoln was the same thing W.B. Du Bois says, that Lincoln had race prejudice. Lincoln believed blacks inferior. Well, Douglass says earlier in other writings, when he's remembering how Lincoln received him in meetings at the White House, Douglass says, Lincoln struck me as entirely free of the prejudices that gripped so many of his white fellow citizens. So Douglass's personal experience with Lincoln was Lincoln treated him like a man. and Douglass was thoroughly charmed by Lincoln, even though he didn't get everything he wanted from him in those White House meetings. He was thoroughly charmed by the way that Lincoln addressed him personally. So yes, I mean, Lincoln says things in the Lincoln-Stephen Douglas debates that Stephen Douglas pretty much forced him into, to say that Lincoln was forced to say he renounced social equality between the races and things like that. And people use those remarks today to make the case that Lincoln was actually bigoted and doesn't deserve the title great emancipator. And Douglas sort of adds to that in the things he says in the 1876 speech, but I think Douglas doesn't mean that, because he's contradicting things that he himself said about Lincoln. And one last point about that same really line of reasoning. Douglas is famous here for saying in 1876, Lincoln was the white man's president, you are his children, we are only his stepchildren, right? In 1865, a few months after Lincoln was assassinated, Douglas wrote a speech. I think he presented it somewhere, but I'm not clear on the historical record of that. Douglas wrote a speech in which he called Lincoln emphatically the black man's president, and I don't think he changed his mind from 1865 to 1876. I think I think the only thing he changed his mind about was whether it was wise in the circumstances to emphasize that point in the Freedmen's Monument address. So that's a little more about why I think what I think.
A couple of questions that we've gotten on this point. David Cedar asks, nevertheless, doesn't it seem that Douglas carefully crafted this speech to not be accused of being ungrateful, which was a critique that was increasingly being leveled against the freedmen?
I think that's true.
I would say yes. I think David, you're right.
And the text itself bears that out, I think, with its regard and attention to the virtue of gratitude. And I think it's important too, Peter, to reiterate the deliberate effort to avoid grievance and victimization, in bitterness in this speech. Rather the focus is on Black agency.
Please, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Also, just in regard, we mentioned the white man's president again. The text itself, I think, raises questions. Both what Douglas says, as Peter mentioned, and well-documented private interviews with Lincoln, subsequently, but also the text itself. And then you have this long paragraph about under his wise and beneficent rule, all the strides that were made towards Black freedom, right? The recognition of Haiti, Blacks fighting in the Union Army is an avenue to citizenship. The enforcement the punishing of the foreign slave trade, which went unenforced. And of course, it culminates with the outburst of joy and thanksgiving on January 1st, 1863. This is, he recognizes this as a momentous event. This is not simply forced into glory. And I think Lincoln is more, I think, and that's important. I think, this praise of Lincoln, while it raises questions, which I think had to be explained, given Douglas's own criticism, early criticism, it also does not simply see Lincoln as an agent, of some providential force, right? Where he's, simply, working out providence without any of his own virtues. It's clear that at the end, his two great missions preserved not only the Union, but the principles upon which the Union stood. Those two are always linked. And Douglass recognized it, right? Preserving the Union and ending slavery, those goals were linked. And difficulties arise when we study Lincoln statesmanship to see a disunion, a disjunction between those two goals, one exclusively or the other. So he then, and why would he again, if Lincoln was so indifferent towards the plight of African Americans and perhaps just used them as pawns on a chessboard to advance the Union cause without any regard for higher moral principle, why would he include the proof of Lincoln's feelings from the second inaugural at the end of this? This gets left out. And it's funny, he says that Lincoln was assailed by abolitionists. He was assailed by slaveholders. He was assailed by men for peace. I think Douglass was one of those assailants.
Douglass was leading the charge among the assailants.
Yeah. And then my favorite, I'll stop talking here, I promise. My favorite passage is when he views Lincoln from the genuine abolitionist ground. Where are we here? We find that very he's quite candid here. It's page 11. By the way, John, I love the way you guys print these off, and then you have like the place on the side for notes. It's great. But
I can't take any credit for it, but I agree.
I really like that. Sorry. His great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin, and second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To do one or the other or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and the powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Without this primary and essential condition to success, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Strong statement, right? That qualifies the white man's president in those earlier criticisms. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably have driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to the rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, he seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment, this is important, he was bound as a statesman to consult, right? There's a difference between, the role of an agitator and the role of an elected official who is oath bound to office. He was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Wow, that gets forgotten. And so I guess my message to those who are listening here is, next time you hear white man's president, demand that the broader picture be taken into consideration, because that's what makes this speech great. This just makes this speech great. The complexity. Recognizing Lincoln's greatness, notwithstanding his flaws, or where he may have fell short for someone from Douglass's standpoint as an agitator. You need both, I think. We need agitators, and we need statesmen to work in tandem with one another. I'm done. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. That some of what is sometimes called ambivalence in Douglass's speech is not so much ambivalence about Lincoln as it is ambivalence about the position that Lincoln was in. There's a sense in which Douglass liked being an agitator because he could say whatever he wanted. As an outsider, he didn't have to worry about getting thrown out of office for saying something unpopular. He spent his life saying unpopular things. But and I don't mean to say it was easy, because he did it at some risk to his own, especially his own personal, safety as well as other things. But he was free to do it. I mean, it was his vocation to speak freely about slavery, and Lincoln, being an elected official or somebody on the, campaigning for office was not fully free. And I think that's built into what Douglass has to say about the differences between the statesman's point of view and the genuine abolition point of view. And I think Douglass was comfortable with the latter, but he came to see that the statesman's point of view really is the superior perspective in the end. And so I think that, it's fairly common. I would maybe venture to say, based on imperfect information, that it's probably the conventional view of academics who study these things, that Lincoln, the conventional view is the view that Du Bois expressed, really, that Lincoln, and that you find represented by Eric Foner now, that Lincoln grew, that Lincoln was sort of in the process of growth and development in evolution. Human beings do grow as we mature, so that's not unrealistic. But the sense is that Lincoln grew to know something, to appreciate the moral depth of a conflict that Douglass knew all along, right? And Douglass says these things early in the war when he's criticizing Lincoln. I see the end from the beginning. I see this has to be an abolition war. It has to be that right now. Nobody else sees that, and he's frustrated by that. But I think that actually what you see in Douglass's speech here in 1876 is that Douglass has grown. Douglass is the one who's growing here. When he, just in the passage that Joe read, when he appreciates the statesman's point of view, which he did not appreciate in 1861, 1862. Douglass thought Lincoln has to declare an abolition war right now. He has to tell Kentucky to go to hell, that Kentucky is not essential to Union victory. Lincoln judged that, well, actually it is. And if we lose Kentucky, we lose the war. And so I have to be careful what I say here. And so I can't accept the abolition proclamations that my generals are issuing. And I have to do things that are unpopular with the abolitionists because there are a lot of people in the North who do not want to fight for abolition. And I gotta keep these camps together. And I think Douglass came to understand that, a little reluctantly, more than a little grudgingly. But Douglass grew into an appreciation of that. I mean, I think it was always Douglass's reflex, and it never went away, to embrace the spirit of John Brown, the uncompromising, radical, militant abolitionism, instantly, right now kind of spirit. But that's not the way that abolition ever could have been accomplished. And he comes to see that, I think, in this speech. He'd come to see it before this, but it's expressed in the speech. And so he has this much greater, this much deeper appreciation of Lincoln. And I think the real turning point, this is what he says in his in the third autobiography, in Life and Times, was that 1864 meeting that Joe alluded to earlier on. That this time around, Lincoln called Douglass to meet him in the White House. It wasn't Douglass petitioning for some, for a policy he wanted. Lincoln thought he was going to lose the 1864 election, and he thought the consequences of that loss were going to be that the North, the Union side, will essentially sue for peace and let the Confederacy go its way. And that will mean the perpetuation of slavery for who knows how long. And so he calls Douglass in and he says, this may very well happen. Can you devise a plan so that we can liberate as many people as possible before this happens, before this comes to pass? And Douglass says about that, that finally convinced me that Lincoln had a deep moral feeling about slavery, and that Lincoln was very much concerned with the fate of the people who were enslaved. And from that moment on, I think Douglass became pretty much a wholehearted admirer of Lincoln.
Franklin has a question specifically about that meeting between Douglass and Lincoln. He wants to know if there are any primary sources available about it.
the primary, I think the primary source
Douglas.
is Life and Times, is Douglas's autobiography.
Okay.
I don't know, Joe, you know the Lincoln literature better than I do.
We
I don't
have,
know of anything that Lincoln said about that meeting.
No, we don't. Not to my knowledge. I hope maybe someday something will show up, but it's primarily the account is based on Douglas.
Yeah.
And Douglas's recollection of this. We do know, though, it's worth saying that we can validate Lincoln's sincerity about this, because at the same time, like within a day or so, a few days, he wrote a letter conceding possible defeat in the election of 1864. So that coincides with Douglas's account that something had to be done, or McClellan and the Democrats were going to come in and reverse all the strides made towards Black freedom. So, ironically, Lincoln proposes something like John Brown's armed Underground Railroad.
Yeah. The first of the John Brown plans.
Simplified.
Yeah. The John Brown plan that did not involve an assault on Harper's Ferry, Douglas was very enthusiastic about. The Harper's Ferry assault he thought was imprudent to the point of almost suicidal madness.
Nadia Mashai asks, my middle schoolers read excerpts of this speech just this morning and felt that Douglas seems to have a positive, almost reverent feeling toward the United States, the nation's capital, and the progress that had taken place. Do you agree with that?
Yes. Yeah, Peter, full plug here. Peter did an outstanding chapter on Douglas in a forthcoming book on statesmanship we've collaborated on.
Buy the book.
And buy the book. But, you said, I read it before to prepare, and you say that you have a phrase there that Douglas had faith in America, simply put, but profound. And perhaps the what's sad is many of the school children were probably, or the grammar school, were they grammar school children, students, were probably surprised, right? Because I think what's reinforced again is not really faith, and that's not a blind faith. That's not a blind faith. Doug, and he says in this speech, in the oration, that he himself, right, has suffered, the debasement of slavery and has come out the other side. And there's a hopeful message. There's a faith in America. There's a faith in progress that imbues this speech. That's very different from, I think, the cynical tone of today, the 1619 Project, most notably. Our principles were false when they were established. Douglas doesn't agree with that.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Joe said. Douglas, you could say it's Joe says it's not a blind faith. It's not an uncritical reverence.
No.
But if you think about this, again, I think a measure of context helps. The United States is emerging. Well, here's how Douglas saw the United States, I think, which is in a way, I think, very similar to the way the founders saw it. That pretty much the whole of world history is a history in which the Republican form of government, popular self-government, is typically very embattled, fleeting. Read what the Federalist Papers say about the history of republics. It's a pretty sad story, right? And you could go beyond that. The social history of the human race is more or less oligarchy in which the vast majority are subject in one degree or another to forced labor. Maybe that's called slavery, maybe it's called serfdom, maybe it's called something else, but it's forced labor. A tiny portion are free from that necessity, and all the rest are pretty much spending their lives just grinding. This is what the country is emerging out of. This is the new order of the ages that the founders are trying to found, is creating the conditions wherein And Lincoln interprets this very well. And read what Lincoln says to the Congress on July the 4th, 1861. That this is what Republican form of government is. It is a form of government in which ordinary people have the opportunity to rise by their own talents, their own efforts. Frederick Douglass absolutely agreed with that. He saw himself as an exemplar. He saw Lincoln as an exemplar of that ethos. And so, what Douglass sees in America is promise. I mean, Douglass is painfully aware of the difficulties in American history, especially regarding race relations. But what he sees is promise. So to the proposition that's more or less ubiquitous today, that America was founded in white supremacy, Douglass says that is absolutely wrong. That what is happening here, this is the way he interpreted the Civil War, is that there's a kind of eternal conflict in human history between principles of liberty and principles of slavery. And Douglass thought it is the peculiar fortune, you might say providential fortune, sometimes he says, of the US, that it is the destiny of the United States that this conflict comes to a head in middle 1860s in the United States of America. This is America's historical mission, to show the way toward liberation. That's how he thought about the promise of the country. And he's often disappointed, but his speeches always end in hopefulness. And that I think is a very, very important thing to teach kids.
There have been a couple questions about the audience here. One of them, I noticed that Douglass often addresses his quote unquote fellow citizens and fellow countrymen, and then follows by mentioning our race. Is he mostly speaking to African Americans? Is he speaking more broadly? And I guess this means, who is specifically gathered at this unveiling of the monument? And then would I be right in saying he understands this is going to hit the papers too? So he understands that he's speaking to a national audience as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much yes in response to all of that. Is he speaking to, and I would add, for African Americans? Yes. Is he speaking to white America? Yes. Is he speaking to the rulers of the country? Yes. There are thousands of people present when Douglass gives this speech. There are all the big shots, elected officials in Washington, starting with the president, and then also members of the U.S. Supreme Court. Douglass alludes to that. There are plenty of just ordinary Black American citizens of Washington, D.C., who are present there. It's a mixed race audience, and so Douglass is speaking pretty much to everybody. And this is another way of putting the complexities of the speech. He's saying, in some sense, he's saying different things to different portions of his audience.
I know that, Peter, you have to run off right at 8, so I want to be respectful of that. There's one more question that Stacy Moses asks. Later on in the speech, Douglass begins to describe Lincoln's physicality, and it seems he compares the physical trials that Lincoln withstood with his own references to his physical trials when he was enslaved. Am I reading that correctly? A son of toil himself, yeah. He was linked in brotherly sympathy with the sons of toil in every loyal part of the Republic. What's the loyal part?
I first of all, Stacy is there. I absolutely love that phrase. I love the metaphor, son of toil. I think there was solidarity between Lincoln and Douglass in this regard. It's worth it if you haven't read Douglass's essay on self-made men to have a look at that, and that'll I think provide even more confirmation for what you just for your interpretation here. And of course, I think it's contrasting. He's contrasting the sons of toil with the slavocracy, right? The disloyal slavocracy who live off the fruits of other people's labor.
Yeah. Let me commit a little bit of political philosophy here in answering Stacey's question. I think one of the things you see, this is partly a partisan disagreement between the Republicans, let's say the 1850s, who are the free labor party, right? Free soil, free labor, free men. And that means something, I think, kind of profound. And Douglass is expressing that free labor principle when he makes this remark about the sons of toil. I think Joe's right. You know, the loyal part of the United States implies the difference between the free labor and the slave labor parts of the U.S. And the idea is that one of the things that the American Revolution means, and the Civil War Revolution, let's say, means, is it promises a victory of a democratic understanding of the significance of laboring versus an aristocratic understanding. And the aristocratic understanding is that a free person is free from labor, doesn't do labor. Labor is fit for the unfree. Labor is what slaves do, right? That's the attitude of the oligarchic or aristocratic South, okay? The attitude of the free labor North, as Douglass maybe idealizes it a bit, is that labor is what common people do, and it's what free people do, right? You know, to labor for yourself on your own farm, for your own benefit, is what free people do. And so labor is a liberating thing, not an enslaving thing. And so when he calls Lincoln a son of toil, he's saying that Lincoln is an exemplar, as Douglass is an exemplar of this attitude about the liberating power of labor when it is by your own choice in your own direction. I will stop with that.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of our panelists as well as our participants for their questions. As a reminder, you'll be receiving an email within the next week. That email will include a link for a certificate of participation. It will also contain a link to the archived webinar. Please, please, please share that link with your colleagues. Get it out there on social media as well. We would appreciate that. If you've enjoyed tonight's webinar, please consider taking a graduate course in our Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do them online throughout the year, or even come to Ashland and take one of our seminars in person. You can find more information about our course offerings, as well as all sorts of other resources for teachers at teachingamericanhistory.org. Tonight's webinar, I am sad to inform you, is the final episode for the 2020-21 season. We have now covered, over the last several years, every single document in the 50 Core American Documents collection.
Wow.
We will be back in August, and at that time, we'll be spotlighting some of our existing and upcoming core documents volumes. So there are plenty of documents that we can talk about. More details and information about how to register for those are expected in the next few weeks. We will keep you posted. So once again, thank you all for joining us. Have a great summer, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and our documents collection for teachers, students, and citizens at Teaching American History or TAH.org.